May 9th, 1944. The Atlantic Ocean, approximately 700 miles southeast of Newfoundland. The water is cold enough to kill a man in under 4 minutes, and Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David already knows this because someone told him this morning, almost as a joke, and he has not stopped thinking about it since. The hatch is open. Below it, inside the pressure hull of German submarine U-505, something is hissing. David does not know if that sound is water coming in or air going out, or a scuttling charge counting down its last seconds before it removes the submarine, the men on the ladder above him, and any possibility of what comes next from the surface of the earth entirely. He knows only that he was ordered to wait for an ordnance disposal team. He knows that no ordnance disposal team is behind him on the ladder, and he knows that the submarine is still moving through the water under its own momentum, beginning very slowly to settle. He goes in anyway. What David does not know, what no one standing on the deck of USS Pillsbury knows, what no one in the United States Navy knows, is that the object he is climbing into will become the most important single intelligence capture of the entire Second World War. That the books inside it will shorten the war. That the machine bolted to the wall will be the thing they were actually looking for all along. He also does not know that no American sailor has done what he is about to do since 1815. 129 years. Часть первая. 129 лет молчания. The United States Navy was not born confident. It was born desperate, and it spent most of its first century trying to prove it deserved to exist at all. October 13th, 1775. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, passes a resolution authorizing the fitting out of 2 vessels, one of 10 guns, one of 14, to intercept British supply ships. This is the official birth date of what will eventually become the most powerful naval force in human history. At the time, it is 2 ships. The British Royal Navy has over 300. The Continental Navy fought, and it fought with genuine courage, but it never fought on anything like equal terms. By the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1783, the Continental Navy had been effectively destroyed. Most of its ships were captured or sunk. The survivors were sold off. The Navy was disbanded. The new republic decided it could not afford a permanent fleet. That decision lasted 11 years, and it cost American merchant sailors enormously. Without naval protection, American ships trading in the Mediterranean became prey for the Barbary corsairs, the state-sponsored pirates operating out of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Algerian corsairs seized American vessels. American sailors were enslaved. The United States government, with no navy to threaten retaliation, paid tribute. It was humiliating in a way that the revolutionary generation found almost physically painful, and it was the direct cause of what came next. The Naval Act of 1794. Congress authorized the construction of 6 frigates. The permanent United States Navy, the one that still exists today, was re-established. And almost immediately it went to work. The Quasi-War of 1798 and 1799 against the French Republic Navy. The First and Second Barbary Wars. The War of 1812 against the British. In each of these conflicts, the young American Navy learned something about itself, refined something about its doctrine, added something to its institutional memory. And in 1815, the final year of the War of 1812, it did something it would not do again for 129 years. It captured an enemy warship at sea. The details of that capture are not the subject of this investigation. What matters is what it meant institutionally. Boarding and capturing an enemy vessel, taking it intact with its crew, its documents, its weapons, is one of the oldest and most prestigious acts in naval warfare. It requires a specific combination of skill, speed, and controlled violence that is different from any other naval maneuver. You are not trying to sink the ship, you are trying to own it. And owning it means getting your people aboard before the crew destroys what you came for. After 1815, the United States Navy fought in other wars. It fought the Confederacy in the Civil War. It fought Spain in 1898. It modernized in the 1880s and 90s, the period naval historians call the New Navy era. By 1943, it was the largest navy in the world, hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, millions of men, and not one enemy warship captured at sea in 129 years. There were reasons for this. The nature of naval warfare had changed. You did not board enemy ships anymore. You torpedoed them, or you bombed them from aircraft, or you shelled them until they sank or surrendered. The idea of pulling alongside a hostile vessel and sending men aboard with weapons was considered a relic, something from the age of sail, something that belonged in Patrick O'Brian novels, not in a war fought with radar and sonar and depth charges. Daniel V. Gallery did not agree. Meet Captain Daniel Vincent Gallery. 41 years old in the spring of 1944, born in Chicago, Illinois. His father was a lawyer. Gallery graduated from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1921, class rank somewhere in the middle of his cohort. Not a standout academic, but a standout in the ways the Navy noticed more than grades. He was aggressive, he was inventive, he had an instinct for unconventional solutions to conventional problems, and a complete willingness to argue with people who outranked him when he thought they were wrong. By 1944, Gallery commanded Task Group 22.3, a hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. The group's job was U-boat hunting in the Central Atlantic, and Gallery had become, over the previous months, obsessed with a question that none of his colleagues seemed to share. What would happen if, instead of sinking the next submarine they found, they tried to take it? He had written up a boarding plan. He had trained a volunteer prize crew, men who had studied German submarine layouts, who knew where the seacocks were, who knew how to identify and remove documents and cipher equipment without triggering scuttling charges. He had submitted the plan to Atlantic Fleet headquarters. The response was not enthusiastic. The consensus was that the plan was operationally sound, but practically impossible. German submarine crews were trained to scuttle their boats rather than Allied capture, and the window between a submarine surfacing under attack and sinking from flooding or demolition charges would be measured in minutes, possibly seconds. Gallery filed the response and kept training his prize crew. The boat they were hunting. To understand what Gallery's men were going to find when they finally got aboard, you need to understand what a German Type 9C submarine was and what it carried. The Type 9C was one of the larger variants of the German U-boat fleet. 76.8 meters long, displacement of 1,051 metric tons, surfaced 1,193 submerged, surface speed of 18.3 knots, submerged speed of 7.3 knots. Armed with 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward, 2 aft, with 22 torpedoes carried, a 105mm deck gun, 2 20mm anti-aircraft cannons, crew complement of 48 to 56 men, depending on the mission. It was not a small boat, it was not a simple machine, and it was, in the spring of 1944, a dying breed. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively against Germany in May of 1943, the month the Allies called Black May from the German perspective, because in that single month, Germany lost 41 submarines. 41 in 31 days. The U-boat force never recovered its offensive capability. The submarines kept sailing, the crews kept dying, but the strategic calculus had shifted permanently. The reason for this shift was complicated. It involved improved Allied convoy tactics, long-range maritime patrol aircraft, centimetric radar that the Germans could not detect, and the cracking of German naval communications. That last element is the one that matters for this story. The Germans communicated with their submarines using the Enigma encryption machine, a device that scrambled radio messages into what appeared to be random strings of characters, and unscrambled them at the other end, using a matching machine set to identical rotor configurations. The Germans believed Enigma was unbreakable. They were wrong. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had been reading German naval traffic since 1941, and the intelligence derived from this, codenamed Ultra, was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war. But Ultra was fragile. It depended on capturing, stealing, or reverse engineering the physical Enigma machines, and, more critically, the codebooks that told operators which rotor settings to use on any given day. The Germans changed their key settings regularly. Every time they changed to a configuration that Allied cryptanalysts had not yet broken, there was a blackout period, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, during which Allied convoys were routed blind and submarine attacks increased. The most recent blackout had lasted from February to December of 1942. 10 months during which Allied ships were being sunk at a rate that, if it had continued, would have made the invasion of Europe impossible. The blackout ended when Allied intelligence obtained new key material, but the vulnerability remained. Every time German Naval Command issued new cipher settings, the clock reset. American and British naval intelligence wanted a working Enigma machine. They wanted the current codebooks, and they wanted a submarine, a complete, intact, operational German submarine, so that they could understand every piece of communications equipment aboard, every procedure, every antenna configuration, every protocol. Not a wreck, not a captured machine from a sinking vessel, the whole boat. Gallery knew this. He had been briefed, in general terms, on what an intact capture would be worth. He did not know the details of Ultra, that was above his clearance level, but he knew the intelligence community wanted this, and he knew his task group was positioned to try for it. The submarine they would eventually find was U-505. U-505 had been commissioned on August 26, 1941, at the Deutsche Werft shipyard in Hamburg. She was a Type 9C. She had completed 6 war patrols. Her service record was, by the spring of 1944, one of the most troubled in the U-boat fleet. Not because she had failed to fight, but because the war had broken her crew in ways that were becoming visible in the operational record. Her first commander had committed suicide at sea in December of 1942. A second commander had been relieved of command after the crew suffered severe psychological stress during a depth charge attack in 1943. By the spring of 1944, U-505 was on her 7th patrol under her 3rd commander, Oberleutnant Harold Lang, a 29-year-old officer from Lübeck who had taken command in late 1943. Meet Oberleutnant Harold Lang, 29 years old, commander of U-505 since November of 1943. A professional naval officer trained in the standard German U-boat qualification pipeline, which by 1944 was producing commanders faster than the war was consuming them. His crew of 59 men had been at sea since March 16, 1944, nearly 3 months. They had not sunk a single Allied vessel. They had evaded 2 air attacks and 1 surface contact. They were running low on supplies, and they were tired in the specific way that submarine crews get tired. Not sleepy, but ground down, compressed, living in a steel tube under pressure for months with no result. On June 4, 1944, U-505 was operating northeast of the Canary Islands, running at periscope depth, trying to find targets. Остановись и подумай об этом. June 4, 1944, 2 days before D-Day. While the largest amphibious invasion in history was being loaded onto ships in southern England, in the waters off West Africa, a tired German submarine crew was about to run into Daniel Gallery's prize crew. Gallery's task group had located U-505 using high-frequency direction finding, a system that triangulated the position of submarines by tracking their radio transmissions. The contact was confirmed by aircraft from USS Guadalcanal at approximately 11 in the morning. Gallery ordered his destroyers to attack. The attack was not meant to sink U-505. Gallery had issued specific orders: attack to force the submarine to the surface, but do not sink it. This was an instruction that required extraordinary precision from his crew, because the standard method of destroying a submarine, depth charges set to detonate at specific depths, was not a precision instrument. You could not reliably force a submarine to the surface without also risking destroying it. Gallery's men managed it. Barely. The first depth charges brought U-505 up. Lang, with his boat damaged and his crew shaken, ordered the submarine to surface. He also ordered the standard scuttling procedure: open the seacocks, flood the boat, destroy the cipher material, get the crew off. This is the moment everything depended on. Здесь ключевая деталь. The average time between a submarine surfacing under attack and sinking from scuttling was estimated at between 3 and 8 minutes. Gallery's prize crew had trained to board, secure, and begin stopping the flooding in under 4 minutes. They had practiced this in harbour. They had practiced it on training vessels. They had never done it on a live enemy submarine whose crew was actively trying to sink it. At 12:32 in the afternoon on June 4, 1944, USS Pillsbury, one of Gallery's destroyer escorts, came alongside the surfacing U-505. The German crew was abandoning ship. Some of them were wounded. Lang himself had been hit by gunfire in the leg. Gallery's boarding party went over the side. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Meet boarding officer Lieutenant Albert Leroy David, 28 years old, from Maumee, Ohio. Before the war, he had been studying at a community college in Toledo, working part-time in his family's hardware store. He enlisted in the Navy in 1942, was commissioned as an officer in 1943, and volunteered for Gallery's prize crew in early 1944, after reading the boarding plan and deciding it was the most interesting thing he had seen since joining the Navy. David led the first group of men down into U-505. The interior of the submarine was flooding. The seacocks were open. The scuttling charges had been set, though they had not yet detonated. The lights were out in several sections. The boat was at an angle, listing to port, and somewhere in the darkness there may have been German sailors who had not yet abandoned ship. David did not know any of this for certain. He went in anyway. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 11 seconds was documented in the after-action reports filed by David and the other members of the boarding party and in the official Navy investigation that followed. Here is what those reports say happened. David's team found the seacocks and began closing them. Another team member, Torpedo Man's mate Arthur Nispel, 24, from Cleveland, Ohio, located and disconnected the scuttling charges before they detonated. A third team began gathering documents from the command center, charts, code books, anything with writing on it, without stopping to read them, without stopping to assess what they had, just gathering. A fourth team worked on the radio room. The submarine did not sink. This requires a moment. The standard German scuttling procedure, executed properly, should have put U-505 on the bottom of the Atlantic inside of 5 minutes. The procedure had been drilled into every U-boat crew. It had worked every other time the Allies had gotten close enough to try a boarding. The combination of open seacocks, flooding, and demolition charges was designed specifically to defeat exactly what Gallery was attempting. It failed for 2 reasons. First, Lang's crew, under attack, under fire, abandoning ship in the water, did not execute the scuttling procedure with complete precision. This was not cowardice, it was the chaos of combat. Second, Gallery's men were faster than anyone had calculated they could be. The submarine was secured. The flooding was stopped. U-505 floated. Udержи эту цифру. 59 German sailors were rescued from the water. All 59 survived. They were transferred to USS Guadalcanal and placed in isolation, not in a brig, but in a sealed compartment, with no access to radio, no contact with the outside world, no way to communicate to German Naval Command that their submarine had been captured rather than sunk. Gallery needed them to stay isolated long enough for what came next, because what came next was the tow. Gallery could not take U-505 to the nearest port. The nearest port was in West Africa, and West Africa, in June of 1944, had too many neutral eyes, too many diplomatic complications, too many ways for word to leak back to Germany that their submarine and everything aboard it was in American hands. If German Naval Command learned that U-505 had been captured intact, they would immediately change their cipher settings. The Enigma material would become worthless overnight. Gallery needed to tow U-505 across the Atlantic to Bermuda, 1,700 miles, in the open ocean. With a damaged submarine that had never been designed to be towed at speed, the tow took 14 days. A теперь самое важное. What was aboard U-505 when Gallery's men finished their inventory? one working Enigma machine, model M4, the 4-rotor variant used exclusively by the German Navy, which was more complex than the standard 3-rotor Army and Air Force models. 2 sets of cipher keys, the settings that told operators which rotor configuration to use, a short signal codebook used for encoding weather reports and position signals, a grid chart of the entire Atlantic showing the German naval coordinate system used to encode submarine positions in radio messages, torpedo data, navigation logs, engineering manuals, the complete technical documentation for every piece of communications equipment aboard a Type 9C submarine. And something else. Something that Gallery's men didn't fully understand when they pulled it from the radio room, but that the intelligence officers in Washington understood immediately when they saw it. The current month's cipher keys. Not last month's, not the previous patrols, the keys in use right now. On June 4, 1944, the Germans changed their Enigma key settings on the 1st of every month. Gallery's men had captured U-505 on the 4th. They had 27 days of valid cipher keys, 27 days during which Allied cryptanalysts could read every German naval message sent and received, without the normal process of breaking the settings from scratch. 27 days of perfect intelligence. The intelligence community called it the most valuable single cryptographic haul of the entire Atlantic campaign. Перечитай эту строчку еще раз. The most valuable single cryptographic haul of the entire Atlantic campaign. Not one of the most valuable, the most. Часть 4. Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The capture of U-505 on June 4, 1944 was not luck. It was the product of roughly 14 months of preparation by a man who had been told, repeatedly, by people with more rank and more institutional authority than he had, that what he was planning was not feasible. Gallery's response to this was to keep training his prize crew and to refine his boarding plan every time he identified a weakness in it. The operational sequence worked because of 3 things that do not appear in any single document, but emerge clearly when you read the full record together. First, the depth charge attack that forced U-505 to the surface was precisely calibrated. The standard attack profile for a U-boat contact called for a pattern of charges designed to destroy the submarine. Gallery's standing orders modified that profile. Lighter pattern, shallower settings, to force surfacing without fatal damage. This was not an improvisation on June 4th. It was a documented modification to standard operating procedure that Gallery had written and drilled into his destroyer commanders weeks earlier. Second, the German scuttling failed in part because Langer's crew was exhausted and undersupported. 80 days at sea, no kills, 2 prior attacks, a commanding officer who had inherited a crew that had already been psychologically damaged by the events of the previous 2 years. The German U-boat force in June of 1944 was not the force that had terrorized the Atlantic in 1942. It was a force that was still fighting, still professional, still dangerous, but stretched past the point where every procedure could be executed perfectly under fire. Third, Albert David went down that hatch. I вот что упустили все. The standard historical account of the U-505 capture focuses on Gallery, his plan, his persistence, his argument with Atlantic Fleet headquarters. Gallery was the architect, but the capture itself depended on a 28-year-old hardware store employee from Maumee, Ohio, leading a boarding party into a flooding, dark, potentially booby-trapped enemy submarine, with no certainty that any of the German crew had actually left. David did not know whether there were armed men waiting below. He did not know whether the scuttling charges had been properly disconnected. He did not know whether the seacocks could be closed in time. He went in anyway. Albert Leroy David was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on June 4, 1944. The citation described his conduct as marked by outstanding courage, prompt initiative, and brilliant professional skill. He was 28 years old. He had been in the Navy for 2 years. He died in 1954 at the age of 38 of a heart condition. He is buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. Now consider what the 59 German sailors experienced. They were pulled from the water. They were treated for their wounds. Lang's leg wound was serious enough to require medical attention, and he received it aboard USS Guadalcanal. They were fed. They were housed. And then they were put in a compartment and kept completely isolated for the next 14 days, with no communication to the outside world, because Gallery could not allow a single word to reach German Naval Command. The 59 men did not know whether their families had been notified. They did not know whether Germany knew they were alive. They did not know their submarine was being towed across the Atlantic. They would not know any of this for months because the United States Navy, on orders from Washington, classified the entire operation and placed the German crew in a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana, where they remained isolated from other German prisoners until after the war ended. German Naval Command recorded U-505 as lost at sea. They issued no change to their cipher settings. They continued transmitting on the compromised keys. For 27 days, Allied cryptanalysts read everything. Samая жестокая ирония, вот в чем. The German crew of U-505 fought with professionalism and courage through 6.5 patrols in some of the most dangerous waters of the Atlantic campaign. They survived conditions that killed thousands of their comrades. Their submarine was lost, not because they failed, but because they were found by a man who had spent 14 months preparing for exactly this moment, commanding a boarding party led by a man from Ohio who had worked in a hardware store 2 years earlier. The gap in the record, 129 years without an enemy warship captured at sea, ended not with a dramatic fleet engagement, but with 4 minutes and 11 seconds in the dark, and a decision by one man to go through a hatch. Gallery himself was reprimanded, not for the capture, that was a triumph, and Washington knew it. He was reprimanded for not immediately informing Atlantic Fleet headquarters of what he had done. He had radioed a vague message about a damaged submarine in tow rather than reporting a capture, because he was concerned that even encrypted communications might be intercepted and decoded by German intelligence before he could get U-505 safely to Bermuda. His caution was operationally sound. It was also, technically, a violation of reporting procedures. The reprimand went into his file. Gallery later said it was the best reprimand he ever received. Daniel Vincent Gallery retired from the Navy in 1960 as a Rear Admiral. He wrote several books about his naval career, including one specifically about the capture of U-505, published in 1957 under the title 20 Million Tons Under the Sea. He died on January 16, 1977, in Bethesda, Maryland, at the age of 73. He is buried at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis. U-505 itself survived the war. After the cryptographic value of its contents had been fully exploited, the Navy considered sinking it as a training target. It was saved by the intervention of the city of Chicago, which lobbied to acquire the submarine as a museum exhibit. Today, U-505 is on permanent display at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, Illinois, the only German Type 9C submarine on display in the Western Hemisphere. It has been there since 1954. More than 60 years. You can walk through it. Lang survived the war. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He died in 2003 at the age of 88. Go back to that morning in June of 1944. The destroyer escort cutting through 8-foot swells. Gallery on the bridge, watching the sonar contacts resolve into something definite. The prize crew below decks, checking their equipment one more time, going over the layout of a Type 9C submarine from memory. The Navy had not done this in 129 years. The men who reviewed Gallery's plan at Atlantic Fleet headquarters were not wrong to be skeptical. The history of the previous century and a quarter said it could not be done. The physics of submarine scuttling said it could not be done in time. The chaos of combat said the variables were too many. Gallery filed the skepticism and kept training his men. When David climbed down that hatch into the flooding dark, he was carrying with him 14 months of Gallery's preparation, 2 years of his own training, and 129 years of institutional memory that said this was not how naval warfare worked anymore. He did it anyway. That is what the record shows. Not heroism in the abstract, not courage as a concept. One specific man from one specific town in Ohio making one specific decision in the dark, and the entire weight of what followed. The cipher keys, the code books, the 27 days of perfect intelligence, the intelligence officers in Washington who called it the most valuable cryptographic haul of the Atlantic campaign, all of it balanced on that single decision. The gap in the record closed at 12:32 in the afternoon on June 4, 1944. It has not opened again. If this investigation gave you something the standard accounts left out, not the version that survived in the official press releases, but the version that lives in the after-action reports, the Medal of Honor citations, and the reprimand that Gary called the best he ever received, press like. It keeps this story visible a little longer. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, and remember, the record is not closed by admirals, it is closed by the men they send through the hatch.